The year was 1943, and the world was in the midst of a devastating war. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had been locked in a brutal struggle since 1941. After the disastrous German defeat at Stalingrad, the Red Army was on the offensive, pushing the invaders back. But in the summer of 1943, the Germans were determined to strike back with all their might, hoping to regain the initiative. What followed was a battle that would change the course of history forever. The Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, a clash of titans that saw thousands of tanks, aircraft, and men locked in a deadly contest for survival. The Battle of Kursk was not just the largest tank battle, it was also one of the most decisive confrontations of World War II, and it marked a pivotal moment in the conflict. It was the final major offensive launched by Nazi Germany in the East, and it was also the battle where the Soviet Red Army began to take control of the Eastern Front, setting the stage for the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. But before we dive into the details of this monumental battle, let's take a look at how the stage was set. The year 1943 was a crucial one in the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Germans had suffered significant defeats in 1942, most notably the Battle of Stalingrad, which marked the turning of the tide on the Eastern Front. The Soviets had pushed the Germans back from the gates of Moscow and had begun a series of counteroffensives, regaining territory and morale. The Germans, however, were far from beaten. They needed a victory to restore their confidence and to try to halt the Soviet advance. Adolf Hitler, always fixated on the idea of a great, decisive victory, ordered the launch of a massive offensive to retake the initiative, Operation Citadel. The goal of Operation Citadel was to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines that extended into German-held territory. The Germans hoped that by cutting off the Soviet forces in this area, they could cripple the Red Army and gain control of vital territory, including the oil-rich Caucasus region. Kursk was a key strategic location for both sides, and whoever controlled it would have a significant advantage on the Eastern Front. Hitler believed that a successful offensive would break the back of the Soviet army and pave the way for further German victories. On the other side, the Soviet Union was well aware of the German plans. Intelligence, including information from the infamous British ultra-code-breaking effort, had given the Soviets a clear picture of the German intentions. The Soviet leadership, under Joseph Stalin, decided that they would not allow the Germans to achieve their goal. The Soviets began preparing for a defensive battle of unprecedented scale, fortifying the Kursk region with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, miles of defensive trenches, and thousands of anti-tank guns. The Red Army was determined to turn the tables on the Germans and strike back when the time was right. As the Germans prepared for their assault, they were confident that their superior tanks, artillery, and air support would enable them to crush the Soviet defenses. However, they had underestimated the Soviet preparedness and the sheer scale of the Soviet defenses at Kursk. The Soviets had not only fortified their positions with trenches and anti-tank defenses, but also employed deep defense strategies. Instead of relying on a single line of defense, they had built multiple layers of fortifications to absorb the German assault and then counterattack. The Germans would have to break through each layer, and with each layer, the Soviet forces would increase in strength. The Germans had several advantages going into the battle. They had the initiative and were attacking, while the Soviets were on the defensive. German forces in the East included some of the most experienced soldiers, as well as some of the most advanced tanks in the world, including the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks. These tanks were superior in armor and firepower to most of the Soviet tanks at the time, including the T-34, which, though a formidable tank, was not as heavily armored as the German behemoths. But the Soviets had their own advantages. They had vast reserves of manpower, with over 1 million soldiers ready to defend Kursk. The Soviet tanks, particularly the T-34, were produced in vast numbers, and their crews were highly experienced. The Soviets also had an advantage in air superiority, with thousands of aircraft available for both defense and offense. Moreover, the Soviet leadership had prepared meticulously for the German assault. They had constructed a series of defensive positions, including anti-tank ditches, minefields, and strongholds that would force the Germans into a battle of attrition. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel. so you don't miss any new daily. The Battle of Kursk officially began on July 5, 1943, when the Germans launched Operation Citadel. The Germans hoped to strike quickly and decisively, using their heavy tanks and highly trained infantry to punch through the Soviet defenses. They planned to advance in two main thrusts. From the north, led by General Erich von Manstein's Army Group South, and from the south, led by General Walter Model's Army Group Center. The German attack was met with fierce resistance. The Soviets had prepared their defenses meticulously, and the Germans quickly found themselves bogged down. The terrain around Kursk was not favorable for large tank battles. The Germans had hoped to exploit their tanks' speed and firepower, but the muddy, uneven ground made it difficult to maneuver. Soviet artillery and anti-tank guns dug into the defensive positions, wreaked havoc on the German advance. The Germans had also underestimated the size and strength of the Soviet forces in the area. The Soviet soldiers were well prepared and determined to defend their homeland. The battle soon devolved into a war of attrition, with the Germans attempting to break through the Soviet lines but unable to make any significant progress. The Germans' heavy tanks, such as the Tiger III, were powerful, but they were also slow, and they quickly became bogged down in the mud and rubble. The Soviet T-34 tanks, while not as heavily armored, were faster and more maneuverable, and they proved to be a formidable match for the German behemoths. The Soviets also had an advantage in the sheer number of tanks. The Soviet tank force at Kursk is estimated to have been around 3,600 tanks, while the Germans had roughly 2,700 tanks, but with many of them being newer and more powerful models. The most famous part of the Battle of Kursk, however, was the massive tank confrontation that took place in the northern part of the salient. The Germans had launched a concentrated attack in this area, hoping to break through and encircle the Soviet forces. The Germans committed their best tanks, including the mighty Tiger I and Panther tanks, but the Soviet defenders were ready. The Soviet forces deployed their own tanks in large numbers, including the T-34 and the newer and more advanced KV-1 heavy tanks. The result was a colossal clash of armor that would come to define the battle. The Germans were also hampered by a lack of fuel and supplies. The extended nature of the battle, combined with the difficulty of resupplying their forces, meant that the Germans were often unable to maintain the momentum of their offensive. The Soviets, with their vast reserves and shorter supply lines, were in a better position to sustain the fight. The Soviet tanks, particularly the T-34s, were more reliable and less prone to mechanical breakdowns than their German counterparts. This gave the Soviets a crucial edge as the battle dragged on. As the battle continued, Soviet forces began to launch counterattacks. The Germans, whose forces were now overextended and unable to cope with the increasing Soviet pressure, found themselves unable to hold their ground. Soviet reserves, well prepared and fresh, engaged the Germans from the flanks, while the Soviet Air Force provided critical support. The German tanks, which had initially been a dominating force, now found themselves in retreat. By July 12th, the Germans had made little progress, and the tide of the battle began to shift. Soviet reinforcements arrived, and Soviet air power began to make a significant impact on the battlefield. The Germans, worn down by the prolonged battle, were no longer able to continue their offensive. In the south, the Germans attempted to break through the Soviet defenses, but once again, the Soviets counterattacked, pushing the Germans back. By July 23rd, the Germans had failed to achieve any significant breakthrough, and they were forced to retreat. The Battle of Kursk had been a decisive Soviet victory. The Germans had suffered heavy losses, both in terms of men and equipment, and they had failed to achieve their goal of destroying the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. The Soviets, on the other hand, had successfully repelled the German offensive and were now on the offensive themselves. The consequences of the Battle of Kursk were profound. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. The Germans had lost the initiative, and the Soviet Union, now firmly in control of the strategic initiative, began a series of offensives that would eventually lead to the fall of Berlin in 2008-1945. The battle also marked the first time that the Germans had been decisively defeated in a tank battle of this scale, signaling the end of their hope for a successful counteroffensive in the East. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most intense battles in history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating content. on the history of warfare and more. Stay curious.